Well, this is one of another set of obscure fantasy games that I think really deserves more attention and extended play. It's called Dark Earth Legends. And the setup, again, we are still talking about working off the basic fantasy tropes. We've got our dwarves, we've got our elves. And in this case, we're back to the sort of mythological history and gods being involved. Humans, of course, and we've got critters that are a lot like orcs called gulls. And so with all this happening, what's going on? Again, here, the cultures and the regions of the setting are particularly well thought out. It is not just a blah continent with dwarves over here, elves over here, and, lines drawn in some sort of random way. Instead, there's a pretty good historical context for why who is where. Most particularly, that the dwarves and elves properly, at least as far as the metaphysics of the setting are concerned, should be focusing themselves on the big war with the elves who went rogue and their gull minions. And there's this huge war over there in part of the continent, and all proper elves and dwarves should be involved in their alliance against them. Well, most elves and dwarves have kind of shrugged and said, bollocks, let's go live with the humans, and they do. So we have what are called common dwarves or common elves who just don't buy into those high and mighty, cosmic war problems. And then, as it turns out, the gulls, in their incidental contact with some of the human cultures, have generated enough interbreeding events so that you end up with kind of literally with a human stock with a great deal of gull contribution. And again, this is now considered a population of its own. We're not talking about people with one gull parent and one human parent. We're talking about people with from a population of people like themselves, and they're called the Ungles. So then it turns out, similarly, that wherever there are lots of common dwarves and lots of common elves, we end up with plenty of half-dwarves and plenty of half-elves, both of whom are considered human enough, for humanity, and depending on any number of other things, the half-dwarves in particular just kind of are born into a dwarf group and, with a human parent, and that's the end of that, and nobody cares. The elves do care. The elves are a little pickier and snottier. The common elves who live with and among humans don't really quite integrate as well as the dwarves do, and they also, the half-elves, apparently are tricky enough in this regard that one group of them has actually become crazy, awful, abominable magicians and have taken over a whole region and are basically their own kind of separatist deal of their own. Again, where you're called a half-elf, but your parents are also called half-elves. We're talking about populations and lineages and stuff rather than instances of just one parent and another parent. Okay, so with all this going on, notice the difference. If you look at my little diagram, culturally, you'll see that the common dwarves, the half-dwarves, and the Ungles get along really, really well. And they get along well with the humans around them, too. They're a little roughnecky, they're kind of like biker culture, but they're not ethnically considered subordinate or questionable. The elf situation is a little trickier. None of the elves really like each other. The true elves, are very unhappy with all these common elves running off and, being uninterested in their trip. And then you've got the common elves who consider themselves still to be true elves and say so, even though they live among humans or in communities among human communities. And then you've got half-elves who either just say screw it to the whole elf thing and run off and live with humans and be a human, or are part of that separatist group. In other words, you can see it's more fraught with the elves. That's the interesting thing, is that if you go by sort of genetics, if you want to, then you see a very equivalent situation with elves and dwarves. But if you don't and look at it culturally, you'll see that the same genetics are parsed differently due to historical, political, cultural adjustments. And that makes a lot of sense too. So what looks like just a classic human, if you just open the page and look at all the races, you're practically looking at the same thing as the first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Player's Handbook. But when you read about it and understand how to play and look at the play options, you say, oh, actually this is a little bit more interesting and nuanced. If I want to play a half-dwarf, it's quite different culturally than choosing to play a half-elf. Kind of cool. All right. Just want to briefly bring up an example of something I mentioned in the Monday Lab, which is to say the tendency or possibility of half-elves being effectively player avatars, the most human of the bunch. The fantasy humans are all in their little fantasy, ethnic groups and their fantasy locations and stuff like that. But the half-elves go anywhere, get along with anybody, and have, in this case in particular, in Legendary Lives, they have ordinary names. They're named Bob, Jane, Mike, Bill, Susie. And they are written in a fashion that is very much in line with any fantasy novel you've read, where a gamer gets magically transported into the fantasy world that they're playing in and then has adventures there. So it's, I mention this as a general phenomenon, but Legendary Lives is one hair away from it being literal, that the half-elf, half-human is a transplanted gamer. It's not, one hair away from saying it. And the other interesting thing is that there are no other half-breeds among their 26 playable races, just elves and humans, and that's what you get, which I find interesting, much more of a meta choice, but still a distinctive choice and a statement involved in it. And finally, we have the game Ramlar from 2006 in its first printing, also having undergone a certain amount of attempted development through crowdfunding and things like that ever since. And the issue with Ramlar, a little bit like Undiscovered, it has a really understandable panoply of playable races. You take a look across them and you're like, oh, I know these guys. We've got this kind of human, that kind of human, this other kind of human, culturally speaking, and then we've got our elfie types, couple elfie types, and then we've got a couple of these and a couple of those. Okay, I see. Ramlar is, I think, unique in my experience for absolutely disallowing hybrids, half-breeds. There is a short piece in the rules which is framed in purely in-setting terms, where it's a reading from a religious or scholarly text in the setting about the myth of the Council of Gods, where they address this and determine that they're not going to do it. They're not going to let it happen. I've attached that text. I think you'll see that it is bizarre. For one thing, it makes no sense and even has agrammatical portions so that the sentences don't even make readable sense, let alone conceptual. They basically just say no. And it's very arbitrary. The greatest of the council gods is dictating what to do to the others, invites dissent in such a fashion as to brook no dissent, and invokes the great god that only this god can talk to as to the source of the judgment. Forget it. Not going to happen. It's weird. One can say, why on earth would, the authors of a fantasy game do this? And on the one hand, the most positive interpretation is simply that they really, really like the way that the numbers options parsed out across their playable races, and they want those to be distinctive blocks that you choose among for purposes of how things interact with one another in the game in play. And upon looking at that, looking at sort of the half-breed notion and perhaps the idea that you're getting intermediates of these number combinations, just grays out the distinctions that they actually do want to see in play. It's a form of niche protection, I suppose, in some fashion. That's the most positive interpretation. Any other interpretation based on the intrinsic content, and particularly looking at the weirdly, flatly unjustifiable in-fiction presentation of it, it's just odd. All right. Those are the examples I've come up with of evident thought being applied to the hybrid half-breed situation in fantasy role-playing, rather than just simply running with what's been done, looking at it and saying, what are we going to do with this as a concept? It is an interesting concept. It interacts with culture. It interacts with setting history. It interacts with options for players in a powerful way. Some of it's a little ham-handed. Some of it's a little baffling. Some of it is a little bit arbitrary. But in all of these, some degree of attention and thought was brought to the issue.